Hi, everyone. It's the Catholic CEO, Henry Katarna. I'm really pleased to have today with us Andrew Flattery. He's the head of Simple Wealth Planning. So we're going to talk about wealth planning, but from a Catholic perspective. So we'll be back to Andrew just in a moment here. But a quick word about the Catholic CEO. Don't forget to check us out on our website, thecatholicCEO.com, and also our project, thecatholiceconomy.com. And so the topic with Andrew today will actually be relevant to that. So I hope you'll check out those two websites and take a look at our offerings, and particularly our daily Catholic CEO email, which has been very helpful to people. So check those out if you can. But Andrew, how's it going today? Welcome.
Henry, it's a real pleasure to be on the Catholic CEO. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm very interested in your topic. You were introduced to us by a good friend of the Catholic CEO, Mark Wilson, actually. And so Mark he figures that you have value for us to contribute, and I know you do. So let's begin, Andrew. You know, in the Catholic CEO Exemplary Catholic Leaders series, we're always interested to know about your faith journey. How did you come to be a Catholic, and were you always a Catholic? And what's the story of your Catholic faith journey?
Well, yeah, thanks for asking. I think the way that I'd have to answer that question is to say that I've been very blessed to be raised in a family that goes back generations in the church. I think flattery means something like Prince Poet in Ireland. And so the Flatteries go way back centuries in Ireland. And on my mother's side, there's my father's side, there's French ancestry, and on my mother's side, there's German ancestry, all of which have long lines of Catholics in them. So I feel very blessed to be sort of the result of that patrimony. Personally, the family I was raised in was a wonderful. I'm the oldest of five. My parents still live in the town I grew up in Northwest Iowa, in the house that my grandfather built and house that I grew up in. And so, I think we just sort of, what's that quote by the Wright brothers where Orville Wright or Wilbur, maybe it was, said that the advice that he asked for folks is to be born in Ohio and to be born to the right set of parents, something like that. I'm probably misquoting it, but in my case, I was born in Iowa to the right set of parents, and we were raised in sort of a conventional Catholic upbringing, 12 years of Catholic school, some of which was okay, some of which, in retrospect was not so great. Like a lot of millennial Catholics, I'm 38, if you will. I'm a cliche in this regard. I think a lot of the guys and gals I went to high school with ended up leaving the church. I sort of had my period of early 20s, if you will, where I had a bit of a falling out, what's the word I'm looking for? Flirting with the ways of the world, if you will, for a period of time until I think I was 24, and I ended up going to confession for the first time in years, probably five years or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
With a fellow that's on YouTube, is this good holy priest. His name is Father Dave Nix. And
yes,
are you familiar with Father Nix?
we follow him. Yes, he's
sure. This was back before he was famous, And
you were one of the originals with him. This is
I think he's touched a lot of people, but this was like 2009, and he did a good job. I think it was like a 25-minute period of time that we spent in there. And the thing that really stuck with me is he told me to pray the rosary, and he told me to, he said 18 minutes a day is the most you can do for your spiritual life in that amount of time. And he told me that I need to surround myself with good and faithful men that I would really want to aspire to be like. And at that period of time in my life, I knew my father. I had my father to look up to, praise be to God, but I really didn't have a lot of role models in the church. And I think maybe that was a period of time where I didn't quite want to look up to my father in the way that I might want to now. And so he did a great job of connecting me with some good men in Denver, Colorado, who pointed me in the right direction, showed me that real men in their 20s can live the Catholic faith. And that was inspiring to me. And that was sort of the start of a long journey that led me to where I'm at today, to be a man that lives for God and tries to strive to lead my family towards God. And sort of the rest is history. It's been a journey, but I've been very blessed that I was sort of pulled out of that malaise that I think inflicts a lot of my friends, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, this is so true. It's and I love your story. I'll go back to the very beginning when you mentioned, Orville or Wilbur Wright said something about Ohio. So I'm actually going to be going to Dayton this year.
Wow.
I'm a ham radio guy, so I haven't been to the big Dayton ham radio convention for several years now, and so I'm gonna see Ohio. But anyway, you were born in Iowa, so I'm glad to hear that, and I really have appreciated hearing about your family. The oldest of five. I'm also the oldest of five, and we grew up in Regina, Saskatchewan, which is really on the prairies, and then later we moved to Calgary, Alberta, near the mountains, and so I understand the value of having, honestly, the men in your life influencing you. To be a man, one needs the good influences, and so my uncles, my dad, my grandfather, all the men in our family, because we were in a family business, very close ties. And I credit them with that. And I also went to a Jesuit high school, and so and it was classical good Jesuits in those days. I'm saying that quite openly with you, that there may be some challenges now with certain approaches, but definitely I made it through in that classical tradition. So I'm glad to hear that, and it's great that you have multi-generational Catholics in your family. Your story about Father Nick's very important, because there's so many people, I think, who listen to us who have gone away in a sense, and then we've come back. So what happens now? You have a family, I presume, and you've got a business, and you're trying to live your Catholic life. And how is that? Do you ever come into conflict? So many people have to resist the culture now because it asks us to do things that are really against the faith. What's your business life like as a Catholic?
Okay, so yeah, I'm self-employed, if you will. I run what's called a registered investment advisor, regulated by the state of Missouri and Kansas. So essentially, I run an investment firm, if you will. And this wasn't always the case. For early in my career, I worked for various firms. In fact, I worked for 2 Canadian banks. And in particular, those Canadian banks, I distinctly remember back in like 2017, 2018, one of the things that they would do every year is they would, I have a LinkedIn page, and they would change the logo on my LinkedIn page. It says where your employer is, and it has like metadata that like creates the logo, and they would change that logo to a rainbow flag.
Yes.
It's like the Royal Bank of Canada is what, blue and gold or something, and they would change it to, or I'm sorry, maybe crimson and gold, and they would change it to a rainbow flag. And I would always look at that and I would grumble. I did not sign up for that. And I would I would delete it from my profile, which is weird, but I didn't want to put myself out there as someone that was sort of going along with the agenda and sort of swimming with the stream. And not only did I not want to do that, but they were just sort of doing it for me. And so I was starting to see these small things, it was never like I was being persecuted in the office or anything like that, but I was seeing these little things that was just sort of rubbing me the wrong way. And, I had some friends that were, local business owners here in Kansas City, still are. We meet up frequently to, Henry, kind of do what you're doing. We meet up and have lunch and sort of talk about the challenges that we're facing in business.
Yes.
And we help each other find jobs and opportunities and these sorts of things. And it's a wonderful little group. And when I got married and my wife was pregnant with our first son, Leo, this group encouraged me to do the thing that I said was part of like the 5 or 10 year plan. I'd say, 5 or 10 years from now, I'm going to start a firm. And they said, it's going to be easier if you do it now.
Yeah.
Because God willing, you're going to have, a bunch of kids, and down the road, it's going to be harder to take that risk, which it was. I had, saved up a little bit of money, but really it was a matter of, a couple of years of living very lean to start my firm, Simple Wealth Planning. And now sort of 3 kids later, they were 100% correct. That was the right time to do it. So, those were the couple of things that happened early on in my life. I think a lot of Catholics can relate to that. A lot of folks want to maybe start the business, but find themselves with the the golden handcuffs that was happening in my firm too, where it was like, you know, you sign these non-competes and you work at these places that pay you well. But you know, you're not always so sure if it's, you know, completely run in a moral Catholic way. But you have the golden handcuffs, because to quit that job would mean to sort of take a step back and have to live a different lifestyle for a couple of years, which we did. But I was young enough and my wife was supportive enough to do that. And God willing, at 4+ years later, it's worked out. I think it's probably gotten harder I haven't worked in sort of corporate America in over 4 years, but I imagine, you know, with the COVID stuff and, you know, now, you know, I mentioned the rainbow flag stuff, like that stuff has just sort of gotten amplified. I imagine it's much harder than what it was even a few years ago.
I think it is. You know, about a year plus ago at the Catholic Economy Project, we had a summit, you know, for people who lost their jobs for conscience reasons. And
Yes.
so that to me was a watershed, because people suddenly realized, wait a minute, I mild kind of, you know, things that are not Catholic or sort of not a little bit against the faith or a little bit of a nudge here and there. But suddenly it mattered. People were losing their jobs, and they had to choose between their income and their faith. And that's a tough choice for many people. For most people, it's intellectually, it's obvious, right? Of course we'll choose the faith. We will choose God and his kingdom over everything else. But golden handcuffs, you mentioned a really important phrase there. Some people are in a sense trapped into it, and I think it's easier when you're younger. So you rightly pointed out the kind of feedback we get these days. People are wanting to leave the corporate job, the downtown job, or the big, you know, manufacturing hierarchy job, because increasingly they're going to be asked to do things that are inimical to the faith. And so you've done it. And so maybe tell us a little bit about that, because there are many people watching who will want to know, how did you start the business? That's what we do at the Catholic CEO. We guide people and we help people as a consultant, you could say. But a little bit more about, what did you do? You saved up some money, and then how did you do your market analysis? How did you decide to choose this field, Andrew?
Yeah. I was painting houses in 2008, which is still my backup plan.
Yes.
If all else
I love
fails,
it.
people will probably still be painting houses. The real estate market crashed in 2008. And as a young man, I thought, well, I should go get a real job now. In retrospect, at the time, I didn't quite understand that maybe these things are cyclical, and, you know, the housing market was going to come back eventually. But, you know, you can make a nice living painting houses that I didn't quite understand when I was a young man. So in any case, I got into working at a couple different investment firms, sort of was interested in investing. I've always been sort of interested in like, free market economics and things of that nature. So as an investor, there's, you know, various parallels that help you, you know, look at the world through that various lens. So I was sort of into that for a long time. And that's what I did at various firms. So when I mentioned that I had left a job at sort of a corporate firm, I was sort of a financial advisor. I was helping folks invest and plan for their future with regards to their finances. And it was very easy for me to sort of recreate my job in the context of just working for myself. So I wasn't pivoting careers per se. I was taking a job that I was, you know, working for a Canadian bank and getting paid a W-2 wage with a 401k and health insurance and all of that. And I was creating it for myself. And so I don't consider myself so much of entrepreneur per se, in that I'm doing market research and trying to find out where the best investment opportunity is to be an entrepreneur. I more consider myself as someone that took the job I was currently doing and then created it for myself, which I think is an option for folks in various fields. And so, of course, there's plenty of entrepreneurism that comes with that, but I'm sort of separating what I do from like a pure entrepreneur, which is like maybe an Elon Musk or something like that, or a Peter Thiel or any of these folks that are really breaking new ground. And so that's what happened. It took a couple of years of saving, a couple of years of doing research to learn just how it's done, like how do you organize yourself? What is, I work in investment management, so it's extremely regulated. How do you manage these regulations? And one of the wonderful things about being small is that it's sometimes it's a little easier to handle the regulation. There are de minimis rules in place that sort of small local firms can have a little bit more freedom than some of the larger firms. So, for example, the advice I can give is a little bit more open-ended than like what I could do at
Yes.
a largely regulated financial institution, a big bank, if you will. And that's sort of one of the benefits to being small. So anyway, I spent a couple of years listening to podcasts and reading and sort of learning about how it's done and planning for what my next step could be. As we mentioned before the call, 98% of what financial advisors do is help folks retire. They help, today it would be baby boomers feel comfortable in retirement and not sell their 60-40 portfolio. And me as a young man, that just never quite jived with the life that I was living. I was, working to support my family. We were, I was investing in various things and working to build my wealth and buying a house and raising children. That was a different set of problems than I'm 66 years old and I can't turn off CNBC and worry about what the Federal Reserve is doing with my 60-40 portfolio by fluctuating the price of money. And I was like, I don't know, that's not really what I'm worried about. Maybe there are folks out there that want advice on a different set of problems. And so when I started my firm, it was more like, I'm going to work with folks like me, families in their 30s and 40s that aren't so hung up on this idea of retirement. And that's what I did. I put myself out there as that. And I sort of put out my shingle, which today is my website. And people have found it through various means like SEO and podcasting and word of mouth.
Sure.
And it's, God willing, it's sort of worked out. And so that's sort of where I would leave that.
Well, it's very interesting too. There's so many topics, and we're going to cover these today. We're going to talk about various types of investing, like real estate and Bitcoin and gold and things like that. But let's fixate on this retirement concept for a bit, because yes, we did speak offline before this interview. The notion of retirement, people have asked me, well, when are you going to retire? Well, I'm going to do what my grandfathers did. They never retired. They changed what they did. They reduced their hours. They put in, work commensurate with their energy and the health at the time as they aged. And there's no such concept as retirement in a certain way. And that doesn't make you a workaholic either. That's the accusation standard that comes from that is workaholism, and so what about the Catholic concept of retirement? Is it a Catholic concept?
Okay, now you're scratching where I itch.
Yes.
I sort of come to this idea through my grandfather as well, who was a farmer in Northwest Iowa. He's deceased now, but he just never really retired. Farmers, they don't really retire unless they sell the farm. He didn't do that, which I think is another thing that, to his credit, he kept the farm and the family. But he just never really retired. He sort of slowed down. And, when Grandpa was in his 80s, they would find him out in the fields, sometimes taking naps in his truck, which scared us, but he's tired. So he didn't drink coffee, so he was taking a nap in his truck. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something there's a more sort of natural pattern to that than what I sort of have come to believe is unnatural, which here in the United States is most people tell me that their goal is to retire at age 65. And that's what most people say. They say age 65. And you got to wonder, like, well, what's so magical about this age 65? Yeah. And when they say retire, most people, I mean, this is maybe sort of changing, but at least probably in the modern period, the last several decades, what people mean by that is literally to quit working and go play golf or find a hobby or play cards or whatever the case may be. I think that's probably changing for both practical reasons and reasons that we're going to discuss, but in any case, it's age 65. I believe the reason for that is very simply because that's when Medicare turns on here in the United States. Sure. You get your socialized healthcare. And me as sort of like a free market advocate, I look at that and I say, well, perhaps that's a malinvestment. perhaps by nudging people with these incentives, people will respond to incentives. It's just sort of a natural thing. And so I'm not even really criticizing people that do this. I sort of see the rationale for retiring at 65. And, at that age, a lot of people are probably ready for a change, and maybe the change isn't necessarily retire per se, but perhaps it should be some sort of pivot. But I think a lot of people, they see that socialized healthcare coming in at age 65 and they say, I'm out, and we're going to start collecting those checks. And so that's always really bothered me, because if you look at history, that it hasn't always been the case that the natural way of things was that you have a 65th birthday and then you decide to retire for 3 decades, which is very realistic now. Someone could have a retirement from age 65 to 95. It's totally foreseeable. And what is that? That's 30 years of essentially stepping away from society. I mean, we've for better or for worse, the world that we live in is sort of aligned around our work in many ways. And I'm not saying that's the perfect way of doing it, but when you retire, you sort of leave society. And so I did an article on my website called "This is Why You Should Never Retire." And in this article, I'm quoting an author who was speaking about this idea, and this author had a friend write him an email that said, quote, "I think the biggest cause of our negative societal state, church, and in every other societal relationship is because our elderly excise themselves when they retire. The wisest, wealthiest, most experienced, and influential people, along with their money, abandon their families, churches, businesses, and communities when they retire. After being gone for 6 months, they come home and wonder, what the hell happened to everything? The reasons they leave are not entirely their doing, but they leave just the same. This has been going on for 60 to 70 years. All of the wealth of every community has gone south, literally and figuratively," end quote. And so that sort of encapsulates my, a lack of comfort with the concept. I think there's various ways you can nuance the idea of retirement and try to make peace with the world that we live in, which, for better or for worse, Medicare isn't going away, or Social Security is not going away, and there's other problems at hand too. But that's sort of how I've come to that conclusion.
It's very interesting. I'm an economist by training, and so I can see in economic theory, it's an abrupt change. This 65 years thing, and of course, in certain countries like France, they're trying to raise it now because there's problematic funding these things, especially through the boomer generation. But it's an artificial concept to interrupt productivity, and I'm not talking about. I don't believe that we are, economic units. We are, children of God who have a role to play. Our job is to get our children and our spouses to heaven, and that's the first and foremost. And of course, we do that through work and through the dignity of work. But I like the idea of pivoting, changing the plan, focusing more on the extended family. I'm a believer in the extended family model, where the 3 generations are close together. And actually, I'm trying to live that now, personally speaking, because I spend time in Texas and I spend time in Canada with children and grandchildren, and I like doing that. But I've also started a new enterprise, and so maybe I'm an example of somebody who's resisting this. I can understand saving, and we're going to get in a second here to what exactly you do with people's money, but saving for the concept of setting it aside in case you need it for medical interventions or care that perhaps Medicare or the Canadian health system doesn't exactly provide. And so there's supplementary savings, and it's also prudent to save for the 7 lean years, you might say. But so I like what you're saying about the concept of retirement. We have to bear our cross daily. Our Lord said, take up the cross daily, didn't he? He didn't say, take up your cross daily until you're 65 and then you can take it easy. Now, I know I'm stretching the point a bit, but this is, it seems to me, a powerful point that we can change. We don't retire and stop. Yet at the same time, your industry really does talk about that. So Andrew, let's turn to what people save up money and they come to see you. What do you do? Where do you invest the money? What do you do with it? How much should they have? What's the system as it works today?
You're right. So there's sort of 2 parts to what a financial advisor does. And they sort of have to work together. You plan your finances around your future, and and you have to find a way to invest to deal with the sort of perils of inflation. And so the first part, I think, has probably always been the case. As you mentioned, there are sort of foundational principles that go back to biblical times, saving during the 7 years of plenty to prepare for the 7 years of famine, if you will. And that is sort of, I think basic good and virtuous things that we could all do as men. I think, I think it's foolish to not save. That's not what I'm saying by sort of dismissing this retirement idea, is that we should sort of spend foolishly and only live for today. And in fact, I'm sort of in favor of trying to leave some sort of legacy in some way, shape, or form, as I alluded to with my grandfather leaving a farm for the family. I think there's a lot of merits to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, what I work with folks on is essentially families come to me that don't want the traditional financial advisor relationship of retire and hand them your $1 million portfolio so that they can put it in a 60-40 portfolio. Essentially, what I do is I charge a flat fee for advice. And what that means is you don't exactly pay Andy to invest for you per se. You can pay me to be your consultant to take you through a basic financial planning process where I, with you, help you come to understanding as to where you're at, where you've been, where you're potentially going, and what your options are to get where it is that you would like to go. And what that means is that the advice doesn't have to be the cookie cutter advice that you might find with another advisor or in sort of like a personal finance textbook. But it could be, for example, I work with a real estate investor. I have a wonderful client who is very big into, believe it or not, mobile home parks. It's sort of his investment niche, as well as I work with individual families that what they'll do is they'll buy individual stocks. And so that is sort of a way that, some Catholics like myself have come to terms with this moral investing dilemma that we come to, where, if you're pooling your resources in various financial products and just buying the market, if you will, you're essentially investing in, enterprises that we might find to be morally problematic. And so one way to handle that is to actually just pick individual stocks. And then the third way that we'll handle this is another thing that I sort of advocate for within reason, which is this idea of buying and holding Bitcoin, which in my view is sort of one of the answers to the monetary insanity that we've seen here in the US over the last several years, where there's been a lot of shenanigans that have happened with the US dollar. And the idea is that Bitcoin could be one of the solutions for that, in the idea that perhaps this could be like a digital gold. Whereas if gold was the foundation of our currency in the 19th century, perhaps Bitcoin could be a base layer of the monetary system in the digital era. And so, in all those three things I mentioned, if you're a real estate investor, or if you like to pick individual stocks, or if you want to buy and hold Bitcoin, you don't actually have to hire a fancy portfolio manager or asset allocator to do that for you. Now, I've done that in the past. I have clients that they don't want to pick individual stocks, and I'm not saying everyone has to do that, but if you do want to do that, you should find a financial planner that will support you in that endeavor of taking ownership of your investing. And so that's the idea. And so we think of investing within the context of an overall financial plan, which is, do you have enough life insurance? Is your savings rate in that sort of 10 to 20% range? As a young family, you should try to shoot for that.
Yes.
Is there a way during the child rearing stage where you can sort of get creative with the plan, where perhaps you're not saving as much as you were before children or as much as you were after your children, but you're recognizing that this is a unique stage in life. And so perhaps you can lower your savings rate during that particular time. Another issue that comes up with young families is the issue of estate planning.
Yes.
So if God forbid something were to happen to mom and dad, is there a guardian in place that will raise your children in the way that you want them to, both
Yes. Yes.
in a way that that is sort of moral and as part of the Catholic faith? That happens a lot with Catholic families. Sometimes there's one side of the family where that's not the case, and you can decide on that throughout the estate planning process. Things like college savings and I mentioned insurance would be the other pieces that are part of the sort of holistic financial planning engagement. But sort of putting all those pieces together is what financial planning is for. A lot of this, a lot of young families can do this on their own. Where I get involved is where there's a bit of complexity. I don't believe that everyone should have to hire a financial advisor. However, when a bit of complexity is involved, here in the U.S., a lot of times that's around things like the tax code.
Yes.
I just went through a deep dive in this legislation called the Secure Act 2.0, which sort of blew up a lot of our tax code and changed a lot of the rules. When you have a little bit of money, or you earn a little bit of money, these things can really affect people in a large way. And so that the sort of tax planning piece is a large part of what I do for families that have to deal with that issue. So that's the idea of simple wealth planning, which is what I named my firm, trying to sort of succinctly create plans for folks that are sort of understandable and relatable, and they don't necessarily have to hire a fancy asset manager to sort of manage their wealth.
Your method seems like a common sense method. So I'm going to ask you then, let's take a look at my grandfathers again. We're talking about our wonderful grandparents. My maternal grandfather was a farmer and a storekeeper, a general store in a small town in the prairies in Saskatchewan, in Canada. And my paternal grandfather was a real estate investor. And they would ask you, okay, property, land, stores, this is how we make our living. They would look at Bitcoin and gold and the concepts that you speak of, perhaps even life insurance, with a little bit of, I wouldn't say they would criticize it, but they might say, Andrew, defend yourself. Tell me why I should learn about gold and Bitcoin and all these other things. What would you say to my grandfathers or your grandfather, who was a farmer?
Or my father, who's the son of a farmer.
Sure, there you go.
Yeah, it's just conversations I've had with my dad. I think so I think the lineage that Catholics like myself get interested, it goes back to what what Aristotle had to say about money, what St. Thomas Aquinas had to say about money, and then in the Catholic tradition there was the Spanish scholastics,
Yes.
who I'm trying to think of some of the names, but through the school of Salamanca, there we go, that were sort of addressing this idea of what the use of money is. And I think a lot of times that can be forgotten, that the idea that money is actually a useful invention. And so the idea is like with money, it allows for us to have a common medium of exchange so that we can trade with our neighbors. So it's a very much the idea of having money is very much, it makes us more communal, because it allows, Henry and I to have to get to trade with each other. And if Henry has chickens and I have cows, but Henry doesn't want cows, but I want his chickens' eggs, I can pay him in money, which is essentially frees us up to have an economy. Going back to a barter economy, while I know there are some Catholics that advocate for that as a more sort of human way, because you're like trading with your neighbors, you're doing it outside of the context of the government. So maybe there's some merit to that if your government is doing things that are immoral. But I don't think that is, I don't think that that's the ideal situation. The ideal situation is that we have a common medium of exchange that we could use to trade amongst each other. And so I think that is sort of how I come to the idea of, gold is money and then Bitcoin as money. Yeah, because like you mentioned, there is because money itself is not, it's just a claim on other goods. It's not sort of a good, I mean, it's not sort of a, what's the word I'm looking for? A capital good in and of itself.
The
When I have,
economist term,
when I have money, I have a claim on other goods,
yeah,
essentially.
economics 101, it would be a medium of exchange is the way
Right.
we were taught that. But so this is interesting. And so I'm actually going to respond. I think that my grandfathers would say, okay, Andrew, good point. That's true. Now they were, in a certain sense, I don't want to use the word preppers for my grandparents,
Mhm.
but they were, the grandmothers were, they would store up canned goods, and they would spend much of their time
Mhm.
preparing for the season ahead, the winter or the next year or two. So the preppers among us, those who are serious preppers who want to do back to the land. There's a lot of Catholic back to the land movement. Our common friend Mark Wilson talks about ecclesiastical ventures where people are coming and they're actually settling. When I go to Clear Creek Abbey on my way to Texas on my road trips, there's about I think it's 200 or 300 people that have settled around that monastery, around that abbey. And this goes on all over the place. They're not preppers exactly, but they're back to the land in the sense that they want to have that cow and the chickens and maybe a little bit of a garden or some other pursuit, an online business or whatever. Does prepping and that whole philosophy with the Catholic overlay fit into the medium of exchange, modern kind of contemporary Bitcoin gold thing? How does that all tie together? Is there an economic theory, the Andrew Flattery economic theory, maybe, that ties it all together?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question. That's always the question, right? Is like, how black pilled should you be?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
there's, of course, there's a limit to how much of a prepper you can be. Are you going to be a prepper and completely disconnect from the economy and be sort of Robinson Crusoe on an island? I think most preppers would say, of course not.
Right.
We're going to engage with the economy in some way, shape, or form, even if we're going to try to sustainably build our community in a way that is more, as Nassim Taleb would say, anti-fragile. Because I think here in the U.S., what we discovered during COVID is a lot of our economy is very fragile.
Yes.
We don't have access to local food production sometimes. Even here in the breadbasket of the world, the Midwest. We don't have sometimes access to local energy sources. That happened in Texas, maybe in your family's neck of the woods
Yes.
during.
We remember that well. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of merit to trying to figure out how to make your local community more sustainable. But I don't know. I don't know how realistic it is to just totally be Robinson Crusoe. And so if you really do want to trade and be a part of the economy in some way, shape, or form, which I think most people do, then the question is, what is that medium of exchange? Now, here in the US, we sort of are privileged in that we have the global reserve currency, the US dollar, that we can use as that medium of exchange. And so this is sort of like not a first world problem for a lot of us that I'm speaking with. In personal finance, it's like, well, cash is trash. You don't really want to have any cash anyway, except maybe some like, $100 bills in your safe at home. And so this is more of like, me talking about the third world problems. My wife's family is from Hungary, which experienced hyperinflation. Recently we've had hyperinflation in places like Lebanon. So people in the third world sort of understand this. Here in the first world, I sort of sound like a crack by bringing these things up. But I think what maybe is more relatable is that we are actually seeing some inflation here in the U.S. In the last couple of years. And so what I would encourage people to do is say, why is that? Is inflation just sort of an act of God, and God decided that across the board everything's going to start costing more, or is there something to the classical definition of inflation, which was really just an increase in the money supply above the demand? That has happened in the last several years, where essentially in printing money in the U.S. and sort of creating more money that's chasing the same amount of goods, we have sort of instigated a lot of this inflation that we've seen here in the U.S. over the last few years. And there's an interesting bishop in the church from like the 13th century. His name is Nicholas Oresme. He was a French bishop in like the 1200s. And there's an author named Guido Holzmann, who's on the Pontifical Academy for Life, and he's written a lot about Erasme. And what he sort of makes the case, Erasme and now Holzmann is sort of his modern popularizer, is that, you know, the king's clipping the coins,
Yeah.
or the princes debasing the money by collecting the coins and adding base metals, and then taking the pure gold for themselves and putting it back into circulation. That is immoral because you're stealing from the people. And I think there is, it's not a perfect correlation because we don't have commodity-based money anymore, but there is an aspect to the so-called money printing in this system that we have today that is immoral. And so what I would ask the preppers is, if you are trading with your neighbors, if you're running a business online, or if you're selling chickens or beef to your neighbors in the real world, what are you using as that medium of exchange? And and you know, is it the U.S. dollar, which, as I just sort of alluded to, has its issues, or is it something that is you know, potentially much better, that was a product of the free market in you know, Bitcoin? And I would even say, look, gold and silver served that purpose for hundreds and, you know, maybe even thousands of years too. And so that's sort of how I come to it. It's like, if you are trading, what is that medium of exchange? And to take it to the next level, there are economists that will talk about, well, what makes a good medium of exchange? And there's various things like, well, it has to be fungible. It has to be actually a good store of value. So you wouldn't necessarily want to trade something that I wouldn't want to sell my products for some sort of hyperinflating currency. I would want to get rid of it as soon as possible. So I would sort of want my currency to be a sort of a store of value, you know, in the same way that gold was a store of value for thousands of years. Maybe that's one of the things that made it a good medium of exchange. And so that is what I would ask them. I think there are some preppers that are into the sort of Bitcoin ethos. And then there were some that would say, no, Andy's just too much of a tech optimist, if you will. We should dismiss this new technology and get back to the earth. And, you know, I sort of understand. I see both sides to it.
Sure. Well, the Bitcoin, you know, I love the concept of Bitcoin because, and I'm not a Bitcoin investor. I'm primarily, you know, a technology investor and a real estate investor, but I like the concept because it is really, unless it's going to be central bank, you know, digital currency, which is a whole other issue. There's a certain safety in it because it's outside the purview of any regulator. That makes it a, you know, that's the Wild West thing that could be the possible effect of that. But here's the thing, Andrew, it comes down to, I'm using the term financial literacy. You're talking about people should learn this. They should ask these questions of themselves. They should come up with the answer. What would you say in the typical Catholic family today? What do we do about financial literacy? Kids come out of school and they go into the workforce with, people tell me, very little knowledge. So what do we do about financial literacy? Where do people learn moral and ethical considerations like this? By the way, we're going to talk about ethical investing yet before we finish today, but what about financial literacy? Like, where do we, is this, I guess it begins at the home, but where else? How do we find financial literacy for our children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and so on?
Oh man, I think I don't know if my grandparents and great grandparents had a lot of financial literacy, or at least the way that we think about it today. You know, a lot of times when you know, when we talk about financial literacy, there's, you know, somebody on Twitter or LinkedIn will say like, we need to teach financial literacy in schools, and of course I think there's probably a place for that, but I don't know if my grandparents or my great grandparents or even yours had that kind of financial literacy. They're, you know, talking about like, you know, you should max out your Roth IRA, or you should invest in low cost index funds because that's better, and Wall Street screwing you over in an actively like, that's kind of what we mean by that. Right. And I sort of I don't know, I'm sort of skeptical that is truly the answer. I sort of think that the reason why we have to do all this financial engineering is probably partially for the reasons I just alluded to. It's like, well, because you can't just save money and invest in your own business and you know, maybe buy a farm, or you know, invest in, your own sort of trade, if you will. You have to sort of earn an income, and then you have to sort of earn it twice by being an asset allocator, some sort of financial engineer, if you will. And so I don't know. I think it's like probably one of these things that we need to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, where to some extent you do have to play the game. I am sort of a Dave Ramsey fan. I think he does good work in sort of educating the masses and helping people get motivated to live within their means and to not take on too much debt and sort of live like no one else, if you will. And so I think Dave Ramsey gets a lot of flack, but I think he does good work in that regard. Not everyone can hire a financial advisor. There probably should be some sort of Catholic version of Dave Ramsey in our parishes, even though I think some parishes do the Financial Peace University. But I think all in all, by Dave Ramsey motivating people to live within their means, like it's a net positive as to what he's done. But when I say, wise as serpents and innocent as doves, I don't think it's, you had a wonderful guest on your show that was talking about the idea of debt in our society. And I think he's right. The problem is, if you are going to live in the world that we live in today, which is a credit-based money and an inflationary currency, it kind of does make sense to borrow money to buy the house. Or to borrow the bank's money to start a business. And so I struggle with that. And I think if you're going to be wise as serpents, you can sort of see a rationale as to why it makes sense to, for example, over the last several years, I had a hard time telling people to pay off their house when they were borrowing at a 2% or 3% rate of interest. When the money is inflating, it's sort of math. It sort of makes sense to keep that loan, even though I think I agree with your guest that it's not necessarily a godly society that is aligned in that direction. So that's what I would say. I would say I wish we didn't need all this education. I don't think our grandparents had it and they turned out okay by just following the wisdom of the ages. However, because we have to be wise as serpents, that's why Dave Ramsey exists.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's a good response that you've suggested here, because it kind of engenders the notion of prudence and of course then the search for Catholic virtue, which is a great protection. And the grandparents, my grandparents, not highly educated people in the common sense of that word, but very wise. Left Poland, Polish immigrants left Poland. In the case of my father's side, one brother went to the U.S., one came to Canada. And then the other side, they came to the U.S. and then actually came up to Canada. So the point is, though, they were prudentially wise, and they'd learned lessons in their life, and they escaped a certain kind of lifestyle and a regime, you could say. But they came and they were prudent, they were smart, and they didn't really ever get taken advantage of because they would think things through. So maybe financial literacy in that sense is about searching for virtue and just being prudent and wise and careful in what you're doing and deliberate. So this is, it's possible.
Yeah. We used to talk about, in the U.S., sometimes this is associated with Protestantism, but I don't think that's the case. We used to talk about the virtue of thrift. And nobody talks about that anymore. The virtue of thrift, the idea of, sort of saving and using the capital goods that you've acquired to acquire more capital goods for your family in your business. I think that's become a lot. It's become like a gauche to say that word anymore.
Right.
You mentioned the Polish Father Dave Nix, who we just talked about. He did a commentary once on the Polish settlers in like the upper Midwest, like Milwaukee and Chicago. Around the turn of the 20th century, he made the case that like these Polish settlers were tithing like 30% or more of their wealth through not only giving away their money, but their labor. So like if you look at these, beautiful churches that have been around for over a century in these cities like Milwaukee or Chicago, they were literally built by the Poles, like the actual parishioners that were like, tradesmen from the old country that were part of these projects. And so he defines tithing not as just giving away your money, but like actually putting their labor to these projects. I don't think a lot of, parishioners today in these newly built churches are necessarily doing that in the way our ancestors will, but that sort of anecdote has resonated with me about the good Polish Catholics.
I love it too. When my daughter used to live in in Wisconsin near Milwaukee, I would often go to the Institute of Christ the King parish in Milwaukee, which I think is called St. Stanislaus, if I'm correct. But it was a former Polish parish, and now it's a Institute of Christ the King, but a beautiful basilica style building built by the pennies, the pennies and the hours of people, Polish immigrants and others. So it's where was I going to go with that? Father Nix and his notion of thrift and saving and this tithing thing. I heard, maybe it was Father Nix or another priest recently said that God only asks, in the strict sense of tithing, God only asks 10%, but our governments are so greedy that they ask for more than God asks for. I mean, we could get into the political sense of that.
Yeah, that was Father Ripperger. I heard that too.
Was it Father Ripperger? Yeah, that's right. It was Father Ripperger. Yeah. So that's the thought. But anyway, I have another area of going back to the investing. So what you do is you give people advice and you teach them principles of investing. I'm oversimplifying, I know, but what about this ethical investing thing? Are you now, in your method, are you putting into the hands of Catholics or your clients, not all of whom are Catholics, I presume, the power, the authority to choose where their investments go, and therefore the ethical investment principle goes back into their hands? Is this a correct way of looking at your service?
That's right. Yeah, and I don't think there's some sort of unfortunately, I wish there was, but I don't think the church has necessarily spoken dogmatically or even practically as to like how we are to do this. So I'm sort of informed by my faith background and talking to people like you and reading various things that like have informed me as to how to potentially do this. And I have sort of a framework that I've come up with. But I think the basis of like where most people approach me from is the sort of default option that is in personal finance textbooks. And, when we talk about like personal finance education, the default option that we are all told to do is to invest in index funds. And the reason for that is it's sort of like the democratization of investing. You can experience the benefits of the growth of the economy and inflation by buying essentially a low-cost index fund, and you win by keeping your fees very low. And I think there's some wisdom in there. The problem is a couple things. I think from just a purely practical investor perspective, I always think it's the example of the checkout line, where if you go to a checkout line at the supermarket, usually they're pretty like at 5 o'clock or something, and it's busy. Usually the checkout lines are fairly even. What people do is they look at the checkout lines and say, oh, that one's a little shorter, I'm going to step in that line, or that particular shopper has got a huge cart, I'm not going to go in that line. And you find like it's sort of efficient, it's like
that's right.
The market is sort of
bit of analysis going on.
Yeah, the free market is sort of worked by like all these individual shoppers coming to their own valuations, if you will. And that's sort of why the stock market could be called what's the word, like reactive, or some people would say efficient, even though I don't love that word. And so there is sort of a merit to just buying the market and benefiting from things like U.S. innovation and the ingenuity of entrepreneurs. But the problem, in my view, is, and Jack Bogle, the inventor of the index fund, pointed this out, is if everybody did that, if everybody just bought the market, if they were naively investing, nihilistically investing, if you will, nothing matters, it would no longer be a market, because what makes it a market is all these individual actors making their own judgments, and you sort of
disparities.
You come up with prices based on that. When everyone sort of blindly puts money into the market and lets an algorithm allocate it to the largest companies, it sort of ceases to be a market. And so that concept, even though I think could work for some families that have been doing this, if you take it to its ultimate conclusion, it doesn't work if everybody does it. And so the second reason why I don't particularly, I'm not totally comfortable with this indexing revolution is that the actual holdings in these funds we might find objectionable as Catholics. So just to use a example that's totally out in the open, and that, you know, I would say most Americans own if they have a 401k or if they have an index fund is actually just Amazon. Amazon, I use Amazon. I've bought stuff from Amazon. It's I think the idea of, making a market out of the world's used books was a brilliant idea. I can now find books for a few pennies or dollars that I would have never had any access to before. However, Amazon is now one of the largest porn companies. They sell pornography on their website. I think somebody pulled up some child pornography there in one of these services that I use that kind of vet these investments. They own a streaming service or a social media company called Twitch. That's like for the video gamers use Twitch, and there's been pornography found on these sites. I know there's a lot of nuance here, and Amazon does a lot of things, but I would just prefer not to own that. There's plenty of other things that I could allocate my capital to that I believe are, places that are well worth an investment, that I just don't want to own Amazon. So the idea is that I think, markets are pretty intuitive. They have a way of allocating capital to where they need them most, but there's plenty of ways that that's also misallocated. And I would from a sort of bottom up stock picking background, I don't start from the top down solution of just buy the market. I start from more of a bottom up approach of let's find some good investments, and we'll diversify in 10 or 20 of those sort of investments. And that's a concentrated portfolio of individual stocks, if you will. And so I think when a lot of people think about like moral investing, that's where they start. The second way I would approach it is these companies that produce these funds themselves, I think, are also immoral in some ways. So if you think of, like, in the US, we have this company called BlackRock. They're the world's largest money manager. Their executives, for the last several presidencies, have always been very well connected to the US presidency. So the current president, Larry Fink, President of BlackRock, is a close advisor to President Joe Biden, which in my mind is cronyism. That's not, there's nothing free market about that. It's he's turned this investment company into a too big to fail bank and used his political connections to essentially enrich this particular company. And if people own index funds with BlackRock, they're sort of, I think, in a way, aligning themselves with this company. And so what can happen is, like, even if you find that the companies that BlackRock is investing in outside of Amazon are not objectionable, what BlackRock can do, or Vanguard could do, or some of these businesses, they can put individuals on the board of directors of these companies that can start to push their agenda. You could call it like the ESG agenda as one example of how this happens. So for example, they can try to promote diversity on their boards, or try to promote, a climate change initiative on their boards by putting their people on these board of directors. They can try to put an LGBTQ, LMNOP agenda on these boards by putting their people on these boards. And these are companies that otherwise you would not find objectionable and you might even admire. BlackRock has that influence now because their index funds own a large piece of these businesses. So I think that's probably one of the more hidden ways that people don't always understand how their portfolios are affected by moral investing. And the third thing I would say is what I already alluded to. Why do you have to invest at all? And shouldn't it be the case that folks can just save their money and they don't actually have to worry about how to be an expert in Amazon stock or BlackRock investment company, and they haven't vetted these for themselves, but they can just save money? And that sort of gets back to the Bitcoin or the gold and silver idea that I mentioned before. And so that's sort of the framework, those three things that I mentioned, both the idea of, like, if you want to invest, you need to have a market, which maybe isn't the case if we all start indexing. And if you are indexing, there's problems about the companies that you own. which is why I focus on bottom up stock picking. And then thirdly, there's also that question of why should you have to invest at all? Maybe we should just be able to save. And there are some different solutions out there that are being posited that could potentially solve that problem. So that's where I would start.
You know, it's very well summarized, really, Andrew, because in the end, we find that we can be easily swept up into the cultural norms of the day, and we can, and Catholics, you know, it's like incrementalism. We can bit by bit start to believe that that's the only approach to life. And you know, our Lord, in following the Catholic principles, our Lord said you can't count the cost. Like we know that you really can't count the cost of supporting the Catholic principles in everything that you do, including in your savings or your investment strategy. So I like that you've summarized it that way, because I think that's good foundational principles for people to adopt. You know, I'm realizing that in the hour that we have today, we're of course nearing the end of it, because it's amazing how quickly it's gone by. And so I think that I'd look for a wrap up from you. Where do we find you? Where do you have any courses, publications, books, events coming up or anything like that, or your website for sure, Andrew? And we'll put the show notes as well.
Thank you, Henry. And this has been a real pleasure. And I know we could take this in so many different angles. And I would love to listen to you more too. So I'm excited to hear more episodes of the Catholic CEO. My website is simplewealthkc.com. So the word simple, the word wealth, K as in Kansas, C as in city.com, which is where I live. And there you can find out more about my firm and myself. The podcast is called The Reformed Financial Advisor. And it's an audio podcast, although I've been told I need to get on YouTube as well too. But just the word, the Reformed Financial Advisor on any podcasting platform.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you, Andrew, for being with us today. May God bless you, your family, your business, all the things that you do for, the kingdom of our Lord on earth here, and that you would prosper in the right sense of that word. So God bless you, and thanks again for being here today.
My pleasure, and best wishes to you, the good work you're doing here at the Catholic CEO too.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, everyone, it's Henry Katarna, the Catholic CEO. Glad you were with us today. Stay tuned. We'll be back another time with another interesting guest.